Now we would love to welcome our dear Ryan Rising with our weekly Gaia Goals in Action call. This call is specifically tackled to see what Gaia goals are in action and how we can really bring those solutions into the world by hearing your experiences about what problems are you solving and how had you had the passion to really make those steps in your community. So Ryan, the stage is yours.
Sure. Yeah, and I just want to invite everyone into the conversation in a really like organic way. I'm much more excited to have a dialogue with you all and just see wherever it goes today than I am to kind of, explain the depths of our project or different things that we've worked on in a kind of like presentation format. I can do some of that, of course, in the introduction, but I just want to invite people to like ask questions, get into dialogue. Let's have a conversation that's really, natural today and see where it goes. So yeah, my name is Ryan. I have been doing community organizing for the last really like 17 years or so. I started off working with some various groups like Food Not Bombs and groups that would go down and demonstrate in Washington, D.C. against the World Bank and the IMF, and some anti-war work around the Iraq War and things like that. And then I got really, really inspired by the Zapatista movement. The Zapatistas are the folks who live in Chiapas, Mexico, who rose up in 1994 against the North American Free Trade Agreement, essentially, and basically reclaimed their indigenous ancestral territory from the nation state of Mexico and the state of Chiapas. And they live in these autonomously governed collective communities, and they've been doing that for the last, we're going on like 24 years now or something like this. I'm forgetting exactly
27.
how long. Really? Yeah. So I was really inspired by the Zapatistas when I was young, and I was spending a lot of time learning about them. And I was coming very much from the perspective of being inspired by their struggle for autonomy, their struggle for women's liberation, their struggle to create horizontally governed communities. And it wasn't until a little later that it kind of clicked that the way that they were able to create autonomy for themselves was through their relationship with the land. It was through creating a relationship with the land in which they were able to create what they needed for themselves and their loved ones, that they were able to garner that autonomy. And that's actually what kind of tipped me over into wanting to learn about permaculture. I actually didn't come from a perspective of being like an environmentalist, caring about saving the rainforests or saving the whales or anything, of that type. It was really like a social liberation perspective that finally was grounded in the fact that the only way that we can create liberated communities and create autonomy is by having a direct relationship with the land in which we create what we need. So that kind of spurred me into learning about permaculture design for a long time, starting up a permaculture design collective. And then after 4 years of working through a permaculture design collective and doing, designs and installs for chicken farms, small backyard gardens, 87-acre properties where, somebody was inheriting something and they wanted to convince all their brothers and sisters to turn it into like a regenerative project rather than just sell it off as real estate. After 4 years of doing that kind of design work, Occupy Wall Street happened, and that was in 2011. And I actually went down to the first 3 days of Occupy Wall Street in New York City and was part of the facilitation of the first General Assembly. And it was using a lot of the methods that I'd previously explored through some of the youth action networks that I was a part of and through the New York City General Assembly, where we used a very similar like consensus facilitation model. And then I was able to bring that facilitation model successfully over to San Francisco, where Occupy San Francisco grew from like 20 to 30 people to about 1,000, 1,500 people at each of our general assemblies every night at 6 o'clock, like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. We'd have 1,500 people from the city coming out to participate in these general assemblies and make decisions together about collective action. I'm gonna stop there for a second because that's really what Permaculture Action Network, which I'll get to in a moment, is about. We're about reminding people that they can take collective action together. They can start new projects, they can start new organizations. I feel it's starting to change maybe in the last like 3 to 5 years, but I feel a lot of us grew up in a society, a worldview where we were kind of told like the options that you see out there are the options that exist. You can get employed, you can go to school, you can, become part of a university, you can become part of some nonprofit program that already exists, but that's kind of it. There's not a lot of room to create new things or to actually organize actions that significantly shift the way that the world is. So we're really here to remind people that you can organize actions, you can organize direct actions, you can start new collectives, you can start new projects. Like, it is about coming together with people you have affinity with and finding common principles, and then, organizing and creating the world more like the way you want to see it. So that's what we do as an organization. Permaculture Action Network started in 2014, 2015, really, when we organized the first Permaculture Action Tour. We had an opportunity to work with the Polish ambassador and Ayla Nerio and Mr. Liff to go on this 32-city tour around the country and organize an action day after each of these shows. So we did that. We basically got in touch with the different place-based project in each city around the country, and we decided on a number of hands-on projects that we would be able to do, as well as some workshops, music, free food. And then we would invite people out from the concerts and the shows to come take part in these hands-on days of direct action. We would build rainwater catchment systems, we would build natural buildings, we would build perennial gardens, food forests, public edible forest gardens, all kinds of things like this. And what we started noticing was that we were getting like 200, 300, 400 people sometimes coming out after a concert to participate in these days of action. And that was really inspiring to us for a while. And we started talking to people more and learning that the vast majority of these people had never heard the word permaculture before, never heard about regenerative anything. They weren't like ecologically or socially focused people. They, had been part of conversations, of course, learned some different things throughout their lives, but this wasn't like a big focus of theirs. And they came out to kind of like see what it was like and get their, feet in the water. And that was kind of where we really saw the crux of like what this project could be, partnering with performing artists and people who are in the world of art and music, and the creation of cultural spaces, those spaces where we come together and find connectivity that we don't usually find in our daily lives, right? We live in these very kind of isolated lives. And then we find that sense of collectivity in a show or in a concert, maybe for a few hours, at most for like a few days at a festival. And we're saying, hey, let's take that sense of collectivity and go build it into the world around us all the time by actually physically transforming the structures and spaces and the layout of the world that we actually live in. Let's make it conducive to that kind of collectivity and community thriving all the time. So we gave that invitation, and we'd have hundreds of people come out, and then they would talk to us a year later or 2 years later and say, hey man, like I went to that concert, I came to the action day, and now I started this food justice project with my friends in Atlanta, and this is what we do. Or I joined this community organization, we started these 3 urban farms, we deliver food, from the urban farms to people that don't have access to nutrient-rich food by bicycle, and we do this, right? Like all kinds of people were telling us these different organizations or collectives or projects they either got involved with or started after coming to a day of action, and we're sticking with for the long term. So we decided to keep doing this. We've partnered with a number of artists since then. We've partnered with Beats Antique, with Rising Appalachia. We've partnered with Michael Franti. We've partnered with Burning Man Festival, or Burning Man, Lightning in a Bottle, all kinds of different performing artists and festival spaces to do this work of mobilizing people to these days of action. At this point, we've done over 100 of these Permaculture Action Days. We've mobilized 15,000 people over the last 5-6 years throughout the country to these days of action. And in doing so, we've worked with well over 100 different grassroots projects and organizations in like 64 cities across the country, 24 different states. And the biggest thing that we lend to those projects in the moment is this big push of material solidarity. Like here, these projects and organizations are that are doing this work all the time. Like they're holding it down all year. And then for this big day of action, people come in, they work on 5, 6, 7 different hands-on projects. A whole ton of material comes in, a whole ton of labor comes in. That sense of like conviviality and community is created for that day. And that often reverberates out where people get connected to the project and they end up, you know, reaching out and seeing how they can support or showing up for like months on end after that. So really our goal in doing that is to provide material solidarity to grassroots projects that are doing this kind of place-based regenerative community work throughout the country, and to catalyze like thousands of people getting involved in this movement for the long run in their own way. So we're really an organization that says like, no, don't look at us, like don't sign up for our newsletter or wait for us to tell you when the next thing is going to be, or, you know, donate to our thing. Like actually find one of these like hundreds of projects that already exist in your community and get involved there. And if that's not satisfying to you, find some people, create affinity with them, find, you know, common principle and start something new, like start a new project, start a new organization, see where you can get out there in this more decentralized way. So yeah, I'll pause there for a minute. I can talk in a little bit about like the just transition mapping project that we're doing to kind of map out some of those spaces. I can talk about some of the more, you know, particular facets of action days we've done or our courses and workshops. But yeah, I'm going to pause and see if anyone wants to throw down.
I'll jump in just for a moment. I've had the pleasure of intersecting with you on a couple of these things back in 2014. When you guys came to New York City, I was enrolled in Andrew Faust's permaculture class, and we did this action day out at the like Newton Creek Alliance. I forget the name of the exact farm, but it was right like over the line after Greenpoint in Long Island City. Mm-hmm. And so that was one intersection, and what a catalyst it was. And then I think like just being a part of that community and seeing where people went from that point, what you just described is like so apt. And another intersection was, I was also there on September 17th, 2011, marching on Wall Street with I was 20 years old at the time, and my 16-year-old little sister was there with me. And I ended up in the kitchen for those 3 months, you know, dishing out 6,000 meals a day at the peak. And anyhow, what those two things have in common, the common thread is like these moments of like a portaling, you know, transformational space on Earth. And I think that like one of the reasons why I was so enthused to have you on is like that emphasis on like locality, place-based action, you know, the Gill Tract Farm, and all these other projects. And so I wonder, I want to leave room for other people to chat and ask questions, but maybe we can just have this as a theme for you to answer. Others is like, how do we continue to create that, you know, in this moment of the pandemic, which we will have to get over, and obviously people still need to eat. So community agriculture is as relevant as ever. Like, how do we continue to create those occurrences that really catalyze transformation in communities?
Yeah, it's fascinating that you bring up both of those, because the one that you're mentioning where Andrew joined us, I think that was like the Boardwalk Community Garden. And we actually did that was one of our action days where we split people up into different spaces, different boroughs, because we had a lot of people that wanted to come out. So we did an action day where people were simultaneously at Smiling Hogshead Ranch in Queens. There were more gardens with a Resh. In Manhattan, we had the Boardwalk Community Garden and then La Plaza Cultural. And then folks were also over at the old Stonehouse Permaculture Landscape. So people from this concert, right, in New York City, like split up to these 5 different locations. And we had action days going on the same day simultaneously at them. But the one you were at was one where it was a very heavily immigrant run community garden that was being displaced for a condominium, right? So right there, we're talking about that kind of struggle between community space to grow food, to grow medicine, to actually produce for ourselves what it is we need. And, you know, the commodification of space, the privatization of space, the creation of everything into like the built environment, and into condominiums and private property to be bought and sold. And that was like a struggle where those people were trying to fight for that community garden. I remember ending that day with everybody taking these big seed balls of clay and like throwing them over the fence. I don't think people were quite ready to like dismantle the fence at this point and take over that space, but it was kind of a symbolic gesture of like throwing these seed balls into the garden that was being taken over by this development company for a condominium. And then the Occupy part is really fascinating because I think a lot of people look back at the Occupy Wall Street movement and kind of look at it as like a political movement, which is fine to do. Like it is true that, you know, we wouldn't have this focus on wealth inequality. We wouldn't have this focus on like the 99% and the 1%, this introduction of that verbiage, which like David Graeber kind of brought actually from, I think it was George Jackson that originally like spoke to that. But a lot of that wouldn't have been introduced into the narrative if it wasn't for that moment. And so we can look at how that's shifting like the political conversation. But really what I think is fascinating about what we were doing during Occupy was creating spaces in which we were actually living out a lot of the principles that we want to bring into the world more fully. Principles like the gift economy, creating spaces in which people would come in and nothing was bought or sold. If you were there, you're most likely, like Samuel was doing, like getting 3 meals a day. You know, the food was free, the food was good. There were free stores, there was medical care for people. There was workshop spaces. You know, everyone was housed. People worked together to make sure if someone didn't have a tent or somewhere to sleep, like someone had a tent or somewhere to sleep. And then all of the decision-making was happening through these horizontal governance structures, right? Through consensus building, through proposal formation and breaking out into different working groups. Also, you know, you had the principle of voluntary association. So people really coming together and creating community on a voluntary basis with one another. Mutual aid was like alive and well in these spaces, right? A lot of the economics of the actual occupations was facilitated through mutual aid. And then you had like the liberating of territory, right? So in our case, like taking over space in the financial district of San Francisco or in the financial district of New York City and turning it into community space again. And that's so much more the actuality of what was happening at the time to me. It was like the actual reclamation of space and the creating of the commune and the experimentation that like we can do this and we're doing it here. We're like practicing and living into a different way of being with one another. I think that's the part that really actually reverberated with people and kind of grew out into the social body much more than it is kind of how it like affected the political conversation, or did we form demands of the state, and were those demands won or not. And that's really like the continuation that I see with a lot of these place-based projects that people are working on, is this idea that we need to like, one, blockade, stop, like slow down the turning of the industrial economy, the industrial infrastructure that is, you know, destroying the biosphere, and like hoarding labor and harming people. And at the same time, we need to re-inhabit place with one another. We need to come back to living in community on the land, actually having relationship with what it is that feeds us and nourishes us and houses us and keeps us, you know, hydrated and well, and all of these things. We actually have to come back into like material connection with what it is that we in our communities need to survive, and we need to do it in like a land-based and regenerative way. And Occupy was just the start of that. And you mentioned Occupy the Farm, which was kind of like a next step for us, at least in the Bay, where that concept of like, okay, we've practiced this, right? We're getting together, we're living with one another through, you know, voluntary association and mutual aid and the gift economy and consensus decision-making and horizontalism, but we're on a piece of asphalt, like we're sitting on concrete. Where do we move our mutual aid away from, you know, taking the leftovers of the system, whether that be like dumpstering food or, you know, getting donations from some grocery store that's throwing things out, or people bringing things down to a camp and saying, here, like distribute this at the free store among yourselves. Where do we move away from that and towards actually creating what it is that we need to live? And so we took over this piece of land in Albany, California, which was owned by the UC, UC Berkeley, and it was given to the UC in the early 1910s for the purposes of agriculture and education. And then at this point, where we did this direct action in 2012, it was very rapidly moving towards becoming a Whole Foods and like a shopping district with like a Panera Bread and a Bank of America and all of these kinds of things. It was basically going to be paved over and turned into a small like mini mall. So we organized a direct action where we occupied that space. Now, mind you, this comes after like 10, 15 years of people trying everything that you're supposed to do within the system as it exists to make change in a way that's, you know, the right way to do things. Like people had signed letters, created petitions, met with all the people at the UC, met with all the people in the city of Albany. They'd come up with master architectural landscape plans for what this community farm could look like. You know, they tried every pathway within the political system as it, you know, exists to try to make this change. And after 15 years of that not going anywhere, people decided to take direct action. They took over the land through this march on Earth Day, and we walked in there and we created a community farm through direct action. And then people like stayed on site and lived there for 4 weeks. Like every night the tents would go up, people would sleep. Every morning tents would come down and people would farm together. 70 really long rows of like conventional organic agriculture, some edible forest garden patches, a kitchen garden, a medicinal garden. There were composting, you know, toilets and composting facilities, workshop space. Like it really was every day growing more and more into this really beautiful community farm. And then eventually that was raided. They had police from 8 different UC campuses come together and raid the farm after formally like cutting off water and then putting a bunch of fencing around it. They arrested some people, and then folks decided to go back every Sunday for a number of months and march back into the farm and water and weed and harvest the crops that were still there. And we ended up distributing a couple tons of organic produce to people for free. And we actually got, you know, Whole Foods to back out of that development deal to go develop somewhere else that had already been paved over. And we actually won a part of that land that still is the Gill Tract Community Farm to this day. So it's now 2021, this was 2012. So we won a piece of that land through direct action, and people are still farming there. Today, they have a relationship with the Segura Te Land Trust, which is the Ohlone Indigenous Women's Land Trust here in the Bay Area. They have a relationship with Black Earth Farms, or what was formerly Black Earth Farms. They're going through a transition right now. So that was kind of the next step of saying like, okay, now let's think about how do we take direct action to actually reclaim space away from capitalism and reclaim it for community and actually create ways of living in a regenerative way with another and creating what we need and distributing that food, that medicine, those building materials, whatever it is that we can create from the earth with people that don't have access to that under the current like rubric of the economy that we live under. So that kind of, you know, propelled us along. And then through the Permaculture Action Days that we've been doing, we've just been kind of like adding to that, like just seeing how many places around the country can we kind of lift up through these days of collective action? How many, you know, hands-on installations can we contribute to putting into place so that there's like as many free roadside farm stands and rainwater catchment systems and community gardens and food forests and natural buildings across, you know, the land mass as possible that can kind of start to build the viable alternatives to the industrial economy and help us shift over to that way of living.
Wow, this is really, 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 really inspiring. And it's like really massive what you've been experiencing and living over the years, and extremely, extremely nice to see it from your perspective and on how like all the different parties and things and activities and events have been emerging and coming together. And what I really find inspiring here is also the connection to the land itself, and your background on building community and creating farms and living examples on how people can really thrive next to each other on the land. Yeah, inspires me a lot. And therefore I would have a question related to owning land with a trust And what is inspiring about that, and how this is something that is becoming more and more innovative and popular in those fields? And why is that? And how can this have an impact or change in doing those collective projects together?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I do want to mention first that I'm really glad to be where we are now in the kind of trajectory of things in 2021. Looking back at some of these actions like Occupy the Farm, which for 2012 was an incredible and very principled action, but I think we would have a different lens on it now. Like, I'm so glad that now we're talking about land back. We're talking about decolonization. We're talking about returning land to indigenous people. We're talking about the need to move land into the hands of people who come from the the African diaspora, right? The like racial and decolonial lens is being brought into this movement back towards living with the land in a way that definitely wasn't happening in the 1960s, and wasn't happening in 2011, 2012 around the Occupy movement. Like, it wasn't until things like Standing Rock and Ferguson, and these different rebellions around like what's commonly referred to as the Black Lives Matter movement that a lot of these conversations started happening. So I'm really glad that we're here in the dialogue. Specifically on the topic of land trusts. Basically what you're doing is you're creating a nonprofit entity, and into the bylaws, you are stating the purpose that the piece of land that the nonprofit owns can be used for. So you're kind of setting some restrictions around how the land can be used, and you're also setting restrictions around how or to whom and for what purposes it can be sold to. And by doing that, you're basically guaranteeing that a piece of land, regardless of who comes in or out of the project, is not going to be turned over to like commercial uses, or sold on the speculative real estate market. And so in doing so, you can kind of guarantee that, let's say I have a piece of land that I want to donate over to a group of really ambitious young, activists who want to do this regenerative project, that even if they all have things that come up in their life over the next like 5 to 10 years, or they get bored or whatever, and they walk away from the project, that they're not going to just sell the piece of land to some developer who then sells it to someone else who like builds another Walmart on it, right? So you're kind of defining and restricting the purposes that the land can be used for. So that's what land trusts are really good at, is taking land out of the speculative real estate market and kind of moving it back into the commons, more or less. Like, it's not quite like the grand vision that we have for like moving land back into common stewardship, but it is a legal tool that we can use to kind of start that process of decommodification of land and moving land back into the commons, and kind of we can put some different purpose statements around it, right? So there's land trusts that focus on low-income housing. So you can state like the purpose of this, the land owned by this particular land trust is for low-income housing, and that's what it's going to stay. We can put land into land trust for the purpose of like regenerative agriculture, or ecological restoration. There's also land trusts that exist around like community arts, and a number of other things too, like forests and things like that.
Thank you for your answer. Yeah, I think it's really interesting when we start thinking about how there is this thriving nature and the protection that is so needed nowadays for like all this land that needs to be protected, and how we can bring it back into the common use for people that are really engaged and passionate about honoring the land and honoring the people living next to it, by protecting as well the biodiversity surrounding those areas. And this is something that we see a lot here in Costa Rica, gladfully as well, about national parks that are expanding more and more and more, and the properties next to those national parks actually being purchased by more conscious or aware people that are actually making huge change here as well. But since we have a lot of people here today in the Zoom meeting, which I'm extremely inspired and grateful for, I would love to open up the space for anyone else who is here and who might have some questions for Ryan, or who has a thought to share. And yeah, anyone who wants, just pop in and ask something.
Yeah, cool. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this super inspiring meeting. There's two quotes I would love to like hammer home to everyone. I know those are strong words, hammering things home, but I really believe they're the keys to the like energy revolution we're seeking for like free energy. And I think that also has a lot to do with our character, with our moral compass, and like us growing up as a species. And so one of them is from this scientist called Richard Feynman, who's a theoretical physicist. And he said, I think every scientist should write on their blackboard the numbers 137, because you could say God himself wrote those numbers. And they have to do with like energy, they have to do with the bridge between the spiritual world and the material world, with so many like discipline branching, overreaching fields. And so that's a really amazing like open mystery, which we can look into. And it's a number that occurs in nature too. And yeah, the second is really something that Nikola Tesla said. And I think it's such a critical point, like just energy itself, right? We are still burning up the planet, like still, you know, everyone knows, right? Don't need to go into that. But he said, and he proved it with his inventions, that the moment people shift, and specifically science as a whole, shifts its focus from the material world to the metaphysical world, we will make so much progress. We will make like more progress than all of science combined in the past, just by shifting the focus to the metaphysical world. And I really want to put in the forefront everyone's consciousness, like shift your focus to your own intention of what you're creating now, what you want to create now, because you really do have the power, and you really are part of like God, like a creator being, like Gaia itself. You're a microcosm of the macrocosm. And yeah, so super inspired to be here with you all. And yeah, if you want to reach out to me, I'm not really on social media, but I'm creating like different movements. And here in Berlin, I'm starting this big project with opera singers, actually, because the way we like tone, the way we sing out into life and into reality, like affects the water around us, the matter around us, and you know, we shift the frequencies of the planet. And so I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but maybe a third thing to throw out there if you're not, like the work of Emoto and Heart Math and the Institute for Noetic Sciences and things like that. All right, so on to my questions. Yeah, this is for you, Ryan. Specifically, how easy or hard do you think it is for people to start a permaculture community, and let's say not in the States? Like just if they want to get on board with your initiative, with your actions. And what do you think of like hemp farming and all of its different uses? And yeah, and thank you so much for listening. Thank you for living your best lives ever and hearing me. Yeah, that's
you're
all
asking
I have to say.
how difficult or easy is it for people to join a permaculture community or start you mean like a land-based project where people are living in intentional community? Or do you mean anything, like including like urban farms and community gardens, public food forests, like all these different ways that that might operate?
Sustainable permaculture, like action networks, which will sort of send those ripple effects out into reality, which we need, that like chain reaction.
Yeah,
and then the role of hemp, if you see one in that.
Yeah, there's really a number of ways of getting involved with that, but the one that I think people kind of look past a lot is to start really locally and close to home and actually look for the opportunities, you know, that often get missed. Like, where are the empty urban lots that can be turned into a community garden that can grow medicine. And then a collective of people can come together and craft that medicine and give it away for free at like a roadside free apothecary stand. Where are, you know, the tracts of land that can be turned into public food forests, and people can be allowed to come harvest from those, instead of thinking necessarily like, okay, like me and my, you know, 7 friends are going to get together and we're going to go buy a piece of property and start an eco village. We can also think in the ways of like, okay, what if we go show up for this, you know, houseless community, this camp that's under the freeway overpass, and like they're doing at Wood Street right now, like what if we start showing up and building natural buildings that can serve as community kitchens, that can serve as clinics, that can serve as homes for people, composting toilets. Like, can we start to create that kind of eco village or permaculture community in a way where we're first and foremost like showing up in solidarity with people that are disenfranchised? Like, they don't have access to go buy a piece of property. They don't have the ability to go, you know, shift over because of wealth inequality and because of privatization of land and these kinds of things. So I'm really interested in those kinds of strategies. And of course, I think it's fine to also go the route of like starting a big regenerative farming project like the Mushroom Farm is doing down in Pescadero, or to start a big eco village project. And I just want to like encourage people to take a really intersectional lens with those kinds of things, because all too often I've seen projects where, you know, someone starts that kind of a thing, and then when you really like unearth a lot of the weeds and look down into the soil, like how has this actually come to be? It's like, oh, somebody, you know, had a lot of inherited wealth at some point, and someone was able to buy this piece of land and like reach out to their friends and invite them to come. And then like the same kinds of, you know, oppressive dynamics between women and men, between white people and people of color, between wealthy or landowning people and landless people, they start to apparate even in those eco-village projects. So I just want to encourage people to think of, you know, starting close to home, like starting with looking around where you are and looking for the opportunities to join in solidarity with people, you know, where they live, and you can start small. And I think it's like ever cooler to try to go into the commons as much as possible, public parks, empty lots, things like that, than it is to like, you know, start in your own backyard where it's just you, or just you and your family in your backyard. But I think it's all necessary, like it's all respectable and good to practice. But I just want to encourage that. Hemp, I don't know a ton about hemp. I'm not going to lie. Like, I know there's a lot of uses for it. I've seen some displays of like an amazing amount of materials and products that we can create from hemp. So like, you know, if people are doing that in regenerative ways that they're finding to be, you know, economically viable or useful for the communities that they're lending that material support to, like, I think that's absolutely wonderful. But I haven't been a part of like a hemp farming project or anything like that intimately enough to really speak on it.
Very cool answers. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, getting right down to business and like thinking in a practical way, like how can I start today or tomorrow, as the case may be here. I have 1/6 of a garden here. It's like almost 1,000 square meters, and there's a forest behind my house. And actually, I'm like an activist by nature. I just like see people, like tell them about what they can do. And this last summer, I was actually just thinking, like, why don't we use our gardens? Like, why aren't the gardens in cities used to grow, you know, all kinds of wonderful foods or plants? At least you speak of medicines. Yeah, I absolutely see it the same way as well. Like, food is medicine. And what do you think of that? And like, how could we get started in our own gardens, or like, I guess when we get a bit more experience, a lot of people are probably jumping into this now too, seeing the need for it, and like how it makes us sovereign. What's a good I can only think of the German word here, Einsteiger, like beginner, like introductory path to follow?
I mean, I think one of the most useful things we can do is just to start invite people into space together. It might sound really corny, like have a potluck, but you know, why not? Like, why not reach out to some of the neighbors that you talk to less or come across less, and see if people want to hang out at 6 o'clock on Friday in the community garden and, you know, have a conversation over a meal. And maybe that conversation starts to naturally turn at some point to, you know, someone's illness that they're dealing with, or someone's, you know, desire to have more lemons, and they really love lemons, but there's no lemon trees around here, or whatever it might be, and start to talk about, well, okay, you know, this is my, you know, 1/6 of the garden plot, but really I don't need the whole thing just for myself. Like, I'd much rather have it be, you know, a common space. Like, do people want to get together and garden here? And then maybe we get together and actually try to make value added products with some of what we're growing, and share that together in community. I think that's a really, you know, a great way to go about it, is to like start dialogues with the people that you live near, and look at how you can come into like crafting things and growing things together and sharing in the benefits of that. I wanted to speak on, you know, something slightly different, because it's just fascinating that like there's 3 people here at least, maybe more, that were involved with that first kind of wave of like Occupy movements type stuff in 2011, which wasn't just in, you know, as you were pointing out, Samuel, wasn't just in the United States. Like you had the Indignados movement and the movement of the squares. And of course that was preceded by, you know, the Egyptian revolt. And then there was like Tassim, and Gezi Park and all of this kind of thing in Turkey. I think it's really fascinating time to be reflecting on that, because I think if you talk to a lot of people during the Occupy movement and been like, hey, what if, you know, we were to take over the Capitol, people would probably have been like, oh, that'd be great. We'd like throw a big General Assembly, right? And now like we're reflecting and being like, no, it wouldn't be great, right? Like actually, it's not great, because like the halls of government are empty. Like that's not where power actually resides. Like power resides in industrial infrastructure. It exists in land, right? Like you were just asking about this thing about like community gardens, and it reminds me of going into like the NYU library and finding this old book from like 1890. And in the book, people are writing about New York City, and they're writing like, you know, the landless peasants of New York City need to like take over the empty lots and start growing, you know, food and this kind of thing. And it's like, you know, for any of us that are of a younger generation, we might be looking like, oh, I thought that like empty lot, you know, kind of guerrilla garden movement started in the last like couple decades. There's writings from like 1880, 1890 of these people being like, hey, we need to take over the empty lots in New York City, and the landless peasants need to like reclaim the land in this kind of way. And it shows that like the historical trajectory of like where power lies has been, you know, pretty steady for a long time. And I think a lot of us that really look into the internal workings of this realize that it really does come down to land access. Like it really does come down to how we inhabit space together and our ability to create place-based projects. Like a bunch of people breaking into the Capitol building and then finding that the halls of government are so empty that all they're doing is like stealing podiums and like art off the walls and wiping poop around, because there's nothing to do. Like there's actually nothing to do in those spaces. I think it points towards a directionality. Like we shouldn't be focusing on the state apparatus in that kind of way. We should be focusing on taking power where we actually live, and taking power by re-inhabiting place together and slowing down and stopping some of the mechanics of the industrial economy that are destroying the biosphere, that are leading to ecosystem collapse. Like that's where we find our powers, in that Joanna Macy's kind of 3 spheres of action viewpoint of like stopping actions that actually slow down or stop the harm that's being done, actions that create viable alternatives and actually create the world that we want to step into, and then those actions that change the story that we're living in, like the cultural, the story that we're painting together. So yeah, I'm fascinated by that. I'm fascinated to be sitting here and looking at the right and kind of being like, well, I'm sure glad y'all were the ones who made that mistake. And, you know, not the other way around, because I think we've been learning and assessing for a while that our most potent actions are actually things like Standing Rock, like blocking that pipeline from being built. Actions like Occupy the Farm, like creating space together to grow food. Actions where people are moving houseless people into empty homes that are owned by development companies in a country where there's 6 times the number of empty housing units than there are homeless people. Like these are the kinds of actions where our power actually resides. So I'm really fascinated by that. I'm fascinated to be here 10 years later from 2011, like looking back on how that kind of trajectory has evolved over time and where we're really finding like the most potent place to be as community organizers and as people who do want to see like a more just and regenerative and liberatory world come about.
Amazingly said. And I really feel that as well. Like we've seen it this past summer, like people going to the streets and burning cars and doing so much aggression with it. When I think that at the end, really it is planting more seeds of change and bringing the focus and the energy into those already existing solutions that you just mentioned, right? So taking those bridges as well and looking for the open communication with local governments on how to access those buildings that might be standing alone, and looking for the mutual conversation. I mean, at least in Germany, we have really amazing connections to our local governments. Also here in Costa Rica, like there is a lot of transition also happening, and a lot of disposition, or like a lot of aperture and opening for a lot of politics that are actually specifically looking for change and for engaged people to support. So bringing more power to the solution, bringing more power to the amazing opportunities that we all have surrounded by us. And this being said, I would love to open up the space for one last question, perhaps, or something pressing that we would like to say. And if not, then we already have 1 hour. So I want to value your guys' time as well. But if somebody wants to say something, please do so.
I have a question, although I'm going to be spending a lot of time with Ryan in April. So if anyone is really excited, has a question you really want to ask, go ahead. But otherwise, I have a question. All right. Well, you brought up that you're really excited and like happy to see that there's more focus on giving land back to indigenous communities. And I think the pandemic was really a catalyst, has been and still is a catalyst for a lot of people to start looking at land-based projects, because now more than ever, I've been hearing people talking about projects they're either starting or planning on starting or already well into starting. And so with people that are more like into these kinds of conversations about decolonization and how we can give back to the local indigenous communities, there's kind of like, people want to create eco land projects, but they don't want to be colonizers. I'm actually part of a conversation of a potential project in Costa Rica that's really exciting, but the big thing is like, how do we do this without coming in and saying, hey, we're all the foreigners coming to your land to build this like eco retreat center that's for privileged people. So there's a big question about how to really work with the local people in a good way, and not just like we're hiring you to be involved, but in a way where it's really like integrated and working together. And I mean, I've seen some really cool examples of land back. Like when I was in Kauai, there was some Kauaian people that came to this gathering I was at, Singing Alive, and they said that they had been going around basically whenever some rich person came in and bought a big piece of land that was like sacred Hawaiian land, they would come and say, hey, this is our ancestors' land. Would you be interested in just giving it to us? I know you just bought it. And finally, on one piece of land that was like one of their most sacred ancestral pieces of land, they went and just told them what the land was and what it meant to them. And this rich person bought the land, and he just felt touched by their story and said, here you go, here's the land, and gave them the land. And so there's like really amazing success stories like that. But then my main question is about the integration, because also when I was in Hawaii, I was at this permaculture meeting, and a bunch of people were saying, oh, the old sugarcane fields are like going, they're not going to be operating anymore, and we want to try to like take it over to be community permaculture land and grow like hemp fields and grow all these permaculture community gardens. And then there was all the local Hawaiians in the back with all of their arms crossed, and they all looked kind of a little bit upset. And then one came and gave a speech, and they're like, how about giving the land back to us? And there was this moment of like, oh, like, why didn't we think about that? And so then it ended up coming to this really nice resolution of saying like, we want to work together with you so that we're not giving you polluted, toxic land from the sugarcane fields, but we actually can work together to regenerate the land and have it community land. And yeah, just in general, I'm curious about your experiences with going about that and ways that you see could be helpful for like working together with local indigenous communities so that we can still bring in like the permaculture regeneration, but also not be colonizers in the process or settlers, and also be working together with indigenous people on land restoration.
Yeah. I mean, I'm gonna let your critique of like how these things work in Costa Rica kind of stand, just because I think you have a lot more experience down there than I do. I have the most experience like being here in the United States, and I want to make sure that we're framing land back not as only like, it's not a request, you know, it can be a request. I really love the example that you pointed out. I think there's a lot like that where people are, you know, going to people that own private property and saying like, hey, do you want to give this back to the African diaspora? Do you want to give this back to Black people in the United States? Do you want to give this back to indigenous people? Like, and it's successfully happening. Like there are a lot of projects like that where people are voluntarily turning over land to collectives of people. You know, it's also for a lot of people, I think, a demand. Like we are demanding land back. And more than that, it's kind of like a directionality. And maybe people can meet in the middle, and there will be different ways of like, and places along the spectrum where that's met. But it's also like a dedication to a struggle, right? It's not like solely a voluntary thing where people are saying like, hey, if and when you guys get around to it, we'd really like some land back now. Like it is a dedication to a struggle that, like, as Malcolm X said, like land like is liberation. Like that's where it is essential. And people are going to fight for it. So I'm really interested in that. And I think we've been like hearing a lot from the Black and indigenous communities and communities of color over the last number of years, and for much longer than that, that it's not about, you know, like power is absolutely essential to how these projects go. And it's not about just consulting people or trying to like work with and bring people into projects. Like we actually have to confront the really serious conversation of like, who actually has political agency at the end of the day, who actually owns it. And I see way too many projects where things get kind of posed and illustrated as some just regenerative collective project where everyone's going to be part of that, you know, everyone's part of it. But when you really get down to it, and it's like, well, who's actually part of the decision making? Who's actually at the table at the end of the day? Whose names are actually on the legal documents? A lot of the times it comes down to like one or two or three, you know, usually white people, often wealthier white people, often men. And so how do we actually engage in projects where people know that they have collective agency and stake from the beginning? And it's not something where they're going to throw down all of this energy and consultation, and then at the end of the day, someone's going to say, hey, we decided to, you know, we don't have budget for the project anymore. We're actually going to sell off the land, and like all that work goes out the window. So I'm really interested in like collective governance structures like that. Leela brought up land trust as one of the strategies that we can take for those kinds of things. But there's also a lot of other strategies that folks can engage in to make sure that, you know, the ownership and the agency is actually collectively shared, and it's actually embodied by indigenous people, colonized people, Black people, people of color, like people who are poor and landless are coming back into agency over it, not just working for those kinds of projects at the end of the day, but they collectively own it. And I'm having a conversation with some folks right now that's been happening for like a couple months now about how do we kind of put that picture together. How do we find, work with, communicate with, locate all of those collectives of people that are ready to step into land stewardship and land-based projects, and match them up with people who either have like a lot of financial wealth and have the power to buy and then give away land to those kinds of projects, or people who already own, you know, vast amounts of lands. And how do we actually like kind of like catalyze and instigate matchmaking, where, you know, people that are displaced from land and people who have been displaced from like wealth and their own labor actually come back into ownership of those projects themselves. So I think that's a really fascinating thing to explore. And I'm really open to those kind of conversations happening like beyond this and offline. Bloom, should we briefly talk about, I know it's a little bit of an absurd shift, but should we briefly talk about the course that we're doing in a month?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm inspired by it at the moment because of, you know, Sarah, who I'm teaching with, and I got together yesterday and kind of went over the class flow, and it's just like an absolutely incredible, you know, assemblage of different like sessions and topics. So I just want to give people kind of a brief on that. It's a permaculture design course with a social permaculture and people care extension. So we're going into a lot of like medicinal plants, herbs, healing, fermentation, etc. But we're also going into a lot of the social permaculture pieces around things like placemaking and neighborhood design, urban permaculture and the built environment. We're doing like an organizing 201, teaching people like the real basics of community organizing. We're doing like an action planning session where we'll actually get into the spectrum of different actions that we can take and how do we actually go about planning actions together. We're teaching about decision making and governance and facilitation and collaborative group dynamics, conflict resolution and mediation, accountability processes, as well as restorative justice and transformational justice. And we'll be going into, you know, of course, like an introduction to social permaculture and things like this as well. There is going to be pieces on adaptogens and herbs and mushrooms for resilience, community herbalism, actual hands-on medicine making, and how to make cultured foods. And then, of course, we're doing like the basic permaculture design curriculum, which is everything from like the ethics and principles through to design process and design methods, how to do site analysis and assessment of a piece of land, and then how to go through the design process and actually implement the designs that you're coming up with. And we'll be teaching, of course, about, you know, water systems and the hydrological cycle, perennial polycultures, food forests, edible forest gardens, integrated pest management and small animal care, designing for wildlife, plant care and propagation techniques, earthworks. I'll be doing a piece that I'm really excited about with Ali, Meters Knight, and Melissa. We're going to be going into like land access and issues of land use, which is a lot of what today's dialogue kind of ended up being around. And then Ali's going to be joining us to teach about traditional ecological knowledge, tech, as well as indigenous land management practices for fire mitigation and designing for disaster. And we have a few other guest teachers that are coming to join us to throw down some other pieces along the way. Like I actually only hit on probably like half to 2/3 of the schedule and kind of what I just went over. So it's an 18-day course. It's happening in California at the Heartland Collective, which is kind of near like Grass Valley, Nevada City, from April 1st to 18th. And it is an on-site course, and we do have a lot of like protocols in place for testing and managing to make sure that everyone stays healthy and it doesn't become like a vector of spreading the coronavirus. We'll be, you know, basically quarantined for 18 days together and testing like before and after. So yeah, you're encouraged to come join us if you want to. If you don't have the ability to join us financially, there is a application on the website where people can apply for either a full or a partial diversity scholarship. And we especially encourage like Black folks, Indigenous folks, people of color to apply for those scholarships to be able to join us. So that's, I think it's heartlandcollective.org/PDC is where you can get more information on that. So heartlandcollective.org/PDC. And, you know, Permaculture Action Network is engaged with teaching like a number of courses and workshops and things like that. We often show up at music festivals and put out these permaculture action hubs where we host workshops throughout the entirety of the event during the day. We also do like smaller courses, 3 to 5 day permaculture action courses, which are more introductory. So yeah, feel free to like stay in touch with us, either Permaculture Action Network on Facebook or at Permaculture Action on Instagram, our website, permacultureaction.org, to look for like other courses and educational opportunities, especially as things start opening up more. People start coming into space with one another.
Wow, I want to join. Oh, thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much for showing up today, for showing up every day, for doing this amazing work. And yeah, just infinite gratitude for all the amazing lessons that we hear here every Wednesday. I'm like in the university learning so much. So thank you so much for everything, Ryan, Robin, Samu. Also, I know that Felipe is there, Ana Maria, and I don't know who this name is, but thank you everyone who joined. And if you guys want to receive the takeaways from this session, subscribe yourself on GaiaProtection.org. There is a newsletter subscription, and soon we will be posting all the edits of the main takeaways, basically, from the last weekly calls. And every first Monday of the month, we're hosting a Gaia Hour, which aims to bring all the speakers together from the previous weeks so that we can have an open discussion about several different topics and just like a panel of solutions. So if you guys follow us on Facebook, you will be up to date with that. But yeah, thank you so much for everything. And I wish you all a beautiful evening, morning, and rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Yulila, thank you so much, Ryan.
Oh yeah, of course.
What a great talk, man. Awesome. So this will live in perpetuity. Follow us on Gaia Protection, and see you guys next Wednesday.
Take care, everyone.
Let's unite! Woohoo!